I found this footer browsing the internet, and it was one that stood out to me. I always have so much trouble designing footers, and I really like the way this one looks. I'll often put a call to action around my footer, so kind of encapsulating all this in a section with the CTA up here, and then the box footer down here, I thought was a really nice look. But the reason I'm doing this video today is because when I tried to recreate this footer using Generate Blocks, I noticed myself using Flex and Grid a whole lot just to set up this layout down here. Deciding when to use CSS Grid or Flexbox is kind of a complicated process, and to be honest, I've struggled quite a bit trying to explain why I would use one or the other. So in today's video, I thought we'd walk through building out this layout where we're going to use both Grid and Flexbox pretty heavily, and I'm going to explain my thought process of why I'm choosing one over the other. Of course, my goal isn't to try to tell you that one is better than the other. The idea here is to teach you what their strengths and weaknesses are so you can use each one to its advantage. Some of them come out of the box more prepared to do one thing, and you kind of have to fight an uphill battle to do another. So by learning how both of them work by default, you can really use both of these display properties to their advantage. If that sounds interesting to you, then stick around and let's get started. Now, before we get in and start building this out, which we are going to do in this video, I just want to talk through this screenshot a little bit while we're looking at it here inside of Figma. Now, oftentimes when I see a big gap in between elements like this, I immediately think of Flexbox because we can use the space between property to space these out evenly. However, looking at this a little bit closer, I don't think Flex is going to be the best option here. And that's because we have this first row of content up here and then this second row down here. And one thing they share is this alignment point right here. I'll draw a line down here and you can see the way these menu items here line up with this down here. If we were to do this section with Flexbox and then this section with Flexbox, it'd be really difficult to try to get those line up perfectly. Now, it's doable if we use our Flex basis, but we kind of have to magic number things to make that work. However, if we were to use CSS Grid for this entire layout, we could line this up on a specific grid column and line this up on that same grid column and get that nice alignment there. Grid also allows us to space out these menu items evenly so each one of them have the same amount of space across them, which is going to give it this nice uniform look. However, there are places like this where we have the copyright information, a privacy, a terms, and a sitemap link. All of these go next to each other. We could use Grid to put things next to each other, but in this case, we don't know how wide any one of these items are going to be, and putting these next to each other using Flex makes a whole lot more sense. They'll just stack next to each other no matter how wide or how narrow they are. So I think there's a few use cases like this where we could use one or the other, but there's going to be one that gives us an advantage or sets us up to make things happen a little bit easier. So instead of just talking about it, let's jump in and start building this footer out. So here inside Generate Blocks, I've gone ahead and created a footer element. I did that by just going to Elements, Add New, it's a block type. And if we go in here into the element, we see the element type is set to footer, and we can open up our little display rules down here. We can see we've set that to the entire site, which is going to set this up as the footer of this website. So let's go ahead and get the basic structure in here. We're going to start with a container. I'm going to go ahead and change that tag name from a div to a section. Inside of it, we can add an inner container. This first one's going to hold that call to action text, but I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that. And the second one's actually going to be for our footer itself. So I'm going to go ahead and change that tag name to a footer here. Now we need to add some padding in here. I'm not going to worry too much about setting all of this up exactly. We're not working on a full website, so I don't know the exact design system that would be appropriate for this website. So I'm just going to put in some kind of generic values for that. However, I do know that call to action section did not span the entire content width here, so we're going to have to make that quite a bit smaller. To do that, I'm going to go into the sizing and I'm going to detach this from our global max width. I'm going to do something maybe like 640 pixels, which just makes this container quite a bit narrower. Now we'll just go ahead and add our heading text in here. Go ahead and say that this is an H2 and I'll copy in that text. Now we're not going to make this a pixel for pixel design. What we're really going for here is the layout. So I'm just going to get a general idea of how big all these elements are, and we'll just make it work in a close enough system. Obviously I'm using a light theme here and the reference site is a dark theme, but this will get us at least where we need to go with the layout. So we have our heading here. We'll put a button underneath and that's going to say talk to an expert. And I'm just going to put a little bit of a border on this because I think it looks a little bit nicer here. And we'll just put in a jump link there so we at least have our hover state. Now, the first thing I notice here where Flexbox might come into play is this entire container with our CTA. In fact, let's go ahead and rename that CTA. The text and the button here are a little bit cramped together. In our reference site, there was a bit more of a gap in between these things. Now we could add some bottom margin to our heading, or we could add some top margin to our button here. But I prefer not to do that if I don't have to. If we ever came back to this layout and wanted to add some kind of other element in between them, it might not space out properly and we're gonna have to go back and fiddle around with that margin. Gap, on the other hand, helps us out a whole lot more. But we don't have gap when we have our default display property here. We need to use either flex or grid. In this case, flex makes a whole lot of sense. We can go ahead and change this to flex. By default, it's going to put those next to each other, but if we go into our flex layout, we can change that to column, and that'll stack those both back on top of each other. Now we do have to do a little bit of extra work here in the align items to align all these items to center to get it back to where we had before, but now we have the ability to use our gap property. We can find that gap here under the flex layout, and in this case, we're looking for our row gap. I want to put something like 40 pixels in between these elements, which will space them out nicely and a little bit closer to what we had in that reference site. What's nice about doing it this way is if for some reason we wanted to change the layout of this and put the button on top and the text on the bottom, terrible layout example, but in this case, it's keeping that 40 pixels of space. Had we put bottom margin on this text, now we'd have to go get rid of that bottom margin on the text, go up to the button and put the bottom margin on it, or add the top margin to this text, whatever it may be. But in this case, because we're using flex and the gap property, it's just going to put a gap between the elements, ignoring which element has the gap on it. It's not like we're attaching that to a specific element, which just makes this whole thing a little bit more flexible. Now underneath this, we have our container here for the footer. I'm going to go ahead and rename that. We'll go ahead and call that footer. And let's go ahead and give this a class. I'm going to call it footer wrapper. And we'll go ahead and hit create. And we'll go ahead and move all those local block styles, which is just that max width in there. We'll go ahead and move those to our footer wrapper class. Now let's go ahead and give this a background color. I'm just using the default generate blocks palette. So we'll just give it this base 2 color, which is a light gray. We also want to go on here and give it a border radius. I'll do something maybe like 12 pixels, which just round out those edges. And we need to go in here into the spacing and add some padding. I'll start with maybe 40 pixels here, and I think that looks pretty good, and that's at least a good enough starting point. Of course, we're back to this issue where our CTA wrapper and our footer wrapper are butted up next to each other. And we have the same set of decisions to make that we made earlier, where we decided not to use margin on these items and instead use flex so we could take advantage of gap. And I think I want to do the same thing here. Now in this case, I'm going to have to go all the way back up to our section. In fact, let's rename that while we're here. Here on our section, we just have the default display property. But if we change this to flex, we can actually start using gap to put space in between our CTA and our footer. So again, let's go ahead and change this to display flex. We want to put this back at a column, and that's going to get things back to where they were before. In this case, I want a bigger gap between my CTA and my footer than I have in between this text and the button. So we'll go down here into our row gap, and I'm going to do something maybe double what we did before. Before we had 40, this is 80. Probably still doesn't look like enough, so we'll go with 120. And that'll space things out to kind of keep the proximity of these things together and a good space in between this, just to show that they're separate ideas here. Now our footer has shrank down because now it's a flex item. So we're going to go back to our footer here, make sure we select our footer wrapper class, and under the sizing, I'm going to go ahead and change this to 100%, which will space it all the way out until it hits its max width, which is using our global max width or the content size of our website. At this point, let's go ahead and reference our drawing again. So I'm going to jump back in here into Figma and kind of take a look at what we need to build out as far as structure. So the first thing I'm seeing are 2 rows here. Let me go ahead and get rid of this fill, and we'll just add a stroke to it, make it nice and bright green so it's easy to see. So we have our first row here, and then I'll go ahead and copy and paste this, and we have our second row which goes down here. Now within this first row, like I said before, I think we're going to have a better time using CSS Grid for this. We know that we have 3 columns right here that's going to fit these 3 items, and that takes up about half the space. So if we went over here and draw it out these 3, so we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, I think a 6 column layout is going to work nicely here. Now in their use case, it does look like there's extra space over here. I think they're actually using a much bigger column system, but I think we can come up with something really close using a 6 column grid. So let's go ahead and just get this structure built out. We know we need our first row here, and then I'm going to duplicate that for our second row. Now both of these are going to need that 6 column grid because we're going to be using that to make sure we can line up those items here. So let's go ahead and give this a class. I'm going to call this footer-grid. Go ahead and hit create. Start with a blank style, and we're going to go into our layout, display, and change that to grid. Now here under the grid layout and under grid template columns, we can pick from these presets here. We can see we have one here for 5 or this one for 6. We're going to go with a 6-column grid here, so I'm going to go ahead and select that. Now we don't see anything change in the design here because we don't have any items inside this grid, but this is going to set us up to get everything moving in the right direction. We're going to want to use that same grid on our second row, so I'm going to go ahead and just add that same footer grid class to that second row as well. Now inside of this, what I'm thinking is we need 2 columns. Let's reference our drawing again. We need this column here and this column over here. That way we can put all these links inside one container and not have them all individual grid items that we have to place specifically on this grid. We can kind of subdivide this grid once we get there. I think that will make more sense. But what I'm seeing here is 2 different columns inside of this, or 2 different containers. So let's go ahead and go back to our example here. And inside this container, I'm going to go ahead and add 2 containers. Now, because we set this up with CSS Grid and 6 columns, it's just putting this in the first grid column and this one in the second. Now, this one over here is actually needing to live in these last 3 columns. So because we have a 6-column grid, we can go in here into the layout and know exactly where we want to put this inside of our grid column. In this case, we want to do 4/7, which is going to give us column 4, 5, and 6. This is where all of our links are going to live, so we know we need that to take up 3 columns of width. However, this first one over here, I think can stay as a single grid cell. We wanted this big gap in between these 2 columns, so I think that works nicely. We'll go ahead and add our logo in here, and I need to upload this from my media library. Underneath that, they have some text, which I'll go ahead and paste in. And then underneath that was that row of social media icons. Since I'm going to put all these social media icons next to each other, I want to go ahead and create a container that they can all be grouped inside of. We'll go ahead inside this container and add a button. And here we'll just speed through going ahead and adding all these buttons. I'll do the first one with you and then I'll speed through the rest. So we're going to go ahead and change this first one to a social icon. We'll make it LinkedIn. Let's go ahead and give this a class. We'll call this footer button, create it, and we're going to move all those local styles over to our class. Now we can go ahead and get rid of this background color. We'll change the typography here, maybe make this a lighter gray. When we go on hover, we want to turn this to a darker color, and let's make sure that we don't have a background on there. Now we also need to deal with our spacing back on this main here. I'm going to do something maybe like 0.5 em, and we'll do that all the way around because this is going to end up being kind of a square button. Now I forgot to get rid of our text on that, so if we go out of our global style here and back to the settings, we can go ahead and turn this show the icon by itself toggle on, which will just get rid of the text in there. Now we have our button. We'll go ahead and add a blank link in here. And we can go ahead and duplicate this button a couple more times so we have all of our social media icons. Now you'll see all these icons went next to each other automatically. I never changed this container to flex, and that's because by default, the generate blocks buttons are set to a display of inline flex, which is going to allow them to go next to each other, which is exactly what we want in this case. So let's go ahead and turn our attention to where our navigation is going to be. Right now, this entire container is taking up 3 cells of our grid, and we want to use that grid for each one of the items in our menu. Now, I debated using subgrid to accomplish this, but I think it complicates things a little bit too much, and since we know this cell is taking up 3 columns, we could just turn this to a grid and use 3 columns inside of it. It's going to evenly splay all of this out so it takes up the same amount of space. Hopefully that makes sense here, but I think once you see it in action, it will make more sense. So I'm going to go ahead here and change this to a display of grid. We'll go inside our grid template columns, and I'm going to choose the 3-column layout here. This way, when we add items to it, I'll just add some containers right now. You can see they're going in 3 columns just like we wanted because we're going to have 3 different columns of links here. So let's go ahead and get rid of all of these and we can start adding our links. Now these links are probably going to need to be list items, which means this container here that we've set as grid needs to be an unordered list. So we'll go in here to our settings, and under the tag name, we're going to change this to UL for unordered list. Now by default, that's going to put some padding or margin on it. So I'm just going to go in here into our spacing and make sure I zero out that padding and margin. I think it's padding, but I always forget if it's padding or margin. So zeroing out both of them doesn't hurt. Inside of that, we're going to need all of our links, which we can just use the text block for. I'm going to go ahead and call this footer-link because we're going to have to do some styling to it as well. We'll go ahead and start with the blank style. Go ahead and type in our first link here, which is just the word press. And I'm going to go ahead and highlight it, and we'll just give it a blank link here. But we can see that styling has changed. We don't want the underline and we don't want this blue color, so we need to do those styling here on our class. Now, because this is a link, we actually need to use this drop down here to select our links. And now we can go into the typography and change the color. Right now it's pulling in from our theme, that blue color, but we want to go with this contrast 2 here, which changes it to that lighter gray color. We also want to get rid of the text decoration, so we can change that to none. We also have some default margin at the bottom of all of our paragraphs, so I'm going to go ahead and change that to 0, although we are going to be changing this to a list item eventually here. Now we want to change this on hover as well, and if we go to this drop down and then click new, we actually have a section here for hovered and focused links, which is exactly what we want in this case. That just builds out the selector for us, and we can hit create. Now here, I want to change this to a darker color, so our darkest color from our palette here. And now when we hover over that, we can see it's getting a little bit darker. I think that's all we need to do as far as the styling here. So let's get out of our global styles and make sure we change this tag name from a paragraph to a list item. Now this gave us our little bullet here. Obviously we don't want that. I think we can go back into our class here, and under list, we can change this list style type to none, which will get rid of that bullet here, which is exactly what we want. In this case, we've turned this menu into an unordered list, which I think semantically is going to make more sense. Now I'll go ahead and duplicate this once, and you can see it went ahead and moved this next link into the next grid cell inside of my grid. As we continue to duplicate that, as we need 6 links inside here, it just keeps filling in all the cells of our grid, which is absolutely perfect. Now let me go ahead and change out all the text here, and now we can see we have all of our links inside here. There's a bunch of space vertically in here, and that's because our footer grid here. If we go back into that class under layout and then alignment, if we set this to align start, that's going to push these back up next to each other because it's aligning everything to the top of our grid. Now that's a little bit too close here, so I'm going to go back into this. We didn't create a class for this. All this was done on the default generate blocks class. Since this is a footer and it's really the only place it's going to get used, I'm not too worried about creating a class for this, although if you want to be extra certain, you definitely could. So we'll go in here under our gap, and we'll make sure to give this a row gap, maybe something like 16 pixels, just to stretch these out a little bit. I think that looks pretty good. We're probably going to want to add a column gap in here as well. As this container gets smaller and smaller with a smaller viewport, we don't want these running into each other, but we're going to tackle that later on as we get to the responsive settings of this layout. For now, I think we got that first row taken care of and things are looking pretty good. So let's go ahead and turn our attention to this bottom row. We used a lot of grid on that top row, but we're going to end up using some flex on this bottom one. Now we already added that footer grid class, which is just setting up our 6-column grid. So we need to go back and reference our Figma drawing to see what we're going to need inside here. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of these squiggles I already drew, and we're going to draw some new ones on here. We can see we have 2 rows of content, this one here that has all of this information, and then a second row here. And then here we have this set of links with a big space in between it, and then these set of links. Now these second set of links here aren't pushed all the way to the end. They're aligning here with that grid we set up. So again, I think we're going to go with 2 different containers inside here. One container to house all these links, and then one container to house all of these ones. So let's go back into our layout here. We already have the footer grid class in here, so let's go ahead and add our 2 containers. Here's our first one, and here's our second one. Now we want this first one to take up about half of the width, or allow it to take up that much space. So we'll go back into our layout here, and under grid column, we're going to do 1/4, which will get us the first 3 columns inside of this grid. We'll go to our second one here, and under layout, grid column, we're going to do 4/7, which will give us our last 3 columns over here, which is perfect. Before we start adding our links though, these are awfully crammed up against one another, so we need to add some gap in between here again. So I'm going to go back to our footer container here and that footer wrapper. Here, we just left that display to default, but I want to take advantage of using the gap property again. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to flex, which is just going to give me easy controls to be able to stack these on top of each other quickly and then be able to use that gap property. So here, we're going to go into our flex layout. We're going to change this to column, which will stack these back on top of each other. And then we can add that row gap here. I think something like 40 pixels might work okay, and that gets us a starting place to work with. Now the container that holds all this actually has a border across the top of it. So let's go ahead and go into our borders. I'll unlink these and give it a 1 pixel border at the top. Maybe we go with our contrast 3 color here just to give it a light gray border. Here we need some padding in between our border and all this text here. So I'm going to go back in here into our spacing under padding. I'll do 40 pixels just to match the amount of space we had in between these two sections here, just so things look nice and even. Here we need to start adding our copyright information. So I'll go ahead and add that text and we'll copy and paste it in. We can see this text is definitely too big. I think we need a smaller set of text that we're going to reuse throughout a lot of this. So I think we should go ahead and create a class. We'll call this footer text small. Go ahead and hit create. Start with the blank style, and here under typography, I'm going to go with something like 0.75 rem, which is just going to make it quite a bit smaller. Now we can duplicate this again and start adding our other links. We had privacy, duplicate that for terms, and duplicate that again for sitemap. Now we need all of these to be on a line next to each other, but we don't really want these to be in a grid because they're not even columns. They just need to take up as much space as they have width. Obviously this copyright line is a lot longer, and then these links are a little bit shorter. In this case, using Flexbox is going to make this a whole lot easier than trying to come up with some kind of grid system that aligns all these properly. So let's go in here and we'll change our display to flex, which is going to put all of these next to each other perfectly. And then we just need a column gap to have some kind of gap in between them. Maybe we would go with something like 24 pixels, which I think spaces them out nicely. Of course, these three are links, so I want to go ahead and add a link to all these. So we'll go ahead and add just a blank link here since I don't actually have anywhere to link them to. But we can see we're getting all that styling from our link showing up. We got rid of that up here by using a footer link class, and I think we can just apply that to these as well. So let's go ahead and start typing in footer. We'll add footer link to all these. And in that case, we're using this footer link class as kind of a utility class just to get all of these looking the same. Now we might have some bottom margin on these. We'll check back on that here in a few, but we have a couple links we need to put inside this container as well. Just so we don't have to add all those links again, I'm going to go ahead and duplicate that last one, and we'll just drag it over into this container and change the text out. Duplicate that one again, grab this text for our second link, and go ahead and paste it in. Now, just like before, we want to put these side by side, and flex is going to be our friend because we don't have an exact amount of columns. We just want to put them next to each other with how much ever space they take up. So again, we'll go display flex, and we'll give it a similar column gap here of 24 pixels. It might have made sense to go ahead and add classes to these two containers down here since we're having to duplicate a lot of these properties. But again, since it's a footer and it's kind of a self-contained element that's not going to be reused, I'm not that worried about it at this point. Now we can definitely see we're dealing with some of that bottom margin issue. I think if we go back here onto our footer small text class, since all of these pieces of text are sharing that, we can go ahead and put a margin of 0 at the bottom of them, which fixes that. But we're still having some issues here. It looks like it was just an extra return I had inside my copy and paste job. But now we have everything lined up nicely. The last thing we need to do is add some text underneath all this. I'm going to go ahead and add a text block and paste that in. Now, since we're using grid on this entire container here, it's only allowing it to fill up one cell. We want this to stretch all the way across. So we can go in here under our grid layout and we'll do grid column 1 over -1, which is going to allow it to go all the way to the end, no matter how many columns inside of our grid. That's a handy little trick here if you just need to space it all the way across. Of course, our text is too big, so we do need to add that footer text small class here, and that got rid of that. Now again, everything's a little bit too cramped up here. If we go back into this container, we've used this footer grid class on here, but we've reused it up here and down here. I want to add some row gap here, but I don't want to affect this one up here. So I think I'm going to have to add a utility class. So I'm going to go ahead and give this the class of footer meta. Go ahead and hit create. We'll start with blank, and we're going to go in here into our layout. And then under our grid layout here, I'm going to give this a row gap of maybe something like 32 pixels, which will just space those out nicely. And at this point, we've used a combination of both flex and grid to accomplish this entire layout here. This is a really good looking footer in my opinion, and being able to use grid in some cases, like where we wanted these things to line up, was really advantageous for us. But using Flexbox in these cases where we don't have an exact amount of columns, we just want things to go next to each other, worked really well, where we didn't have to fight against the default behavior of all of these different display properties. Now it's time we just make everything responsive, and looking at the source site, I think we can do this pretty easily. I'll go ahead and pull up the example site here, and we'll scroll down until we get to the footer. Here we can see at the desktop breakpoint, it looks just like we had it inside of ours. But once it snaps to the tablet breakpoint here, around 1,000 pixels or so, it just stacks everything pretty much into a single column. So I think we can accomplish something very similar to this pretty easily with the setup we already have. Now I did notice they put all of their links here before the logo, so we can switch that order there. I'm not worried about doing this exactly the way they did it in their demo, but I think we can get something pretty close here. So let's go ahead and take a look at what we got when we go into our tablet mode. Now here we can see this top row inside of our footer actually looks pretty decent. We might want to space this out a little bit further if we wanted to keep this 2-column. Down here is quite a bit of a mess though. In their example, they just went ahead and stacked everything on top of each other. I think I'm going to do things just slightly different here. So let's go inside this column here that holds our logo and social information. It's only spanning 1 column right now, but I think we could actually make this span 2. So if we go to 1/3, that's going to put things next to each other pretty nicely. I think that looks pretty good here on tablet, and certainly better than all the empty space that would be created if we just stacked everything on top of one another. Now at the bottom part of our footer here, obviously we have some issues. I'm going to go to this first container here, and we're going to change this grid column to 1/-1, the little trick we learned earlier, to be able to go ahead and span it across the entire thing. We'll do the same thing to the second container here. We'll go under our grid column and we'll do 1/-1, which will allow it to span the entire area. Here, I think this looks pretty good on tablet, so I'm going to leave things alone. We'll go down to our mobile version now, and obviously we have some trouble and we're going to need to change things around. So here inside this grid column, again, we're going to want this to span all the way across, so we'll do 1/-1. That will allow it to span the entire width. Same thing for the second one here, grid column 1/-1, which will allow it to span the entire width. Now we do want to put this before the logo and information. So if we just stay on this container and we change this order to -1, that will go ahead and bring it up in the order. Now we definitely have some issues here with all of these kind of running into one another. They're still trying to take up 3 columns as well. I think we actually want to get rid of all that at this point. So here under our layout, under our grid template columns, since we're already using a display grid inside this, I'm just going to change this to 1FR and keep the display grid instead of going to something like flex or even block layout. This allows us to go without changing those properties here, but get everything on a single line since these are only allowed to span 1 full column across here. Now we have some gap issue here. So if we go back into this container that's holding both of these, we can go into our layout under our row gap and give it maybe 40 pixels of gap, which will just space things out nicely. We need to do something similar here inside this bottom part of our footer. Here we were actually using flex for all this before, so we'll leave that display property here. We can see it's flex. We'll leave it at flex just like we had before, but here we're going to change the flex direction to column, which will just allow these to stack on top of each other. We'll do the same thing inside this container here. We'll go into our flex layout and change that to column, which will allow them to stack as well. Now I do want a little bit of row gap in between these. Maybe we go with something like 8 pixels here. Again, not using a class is coming to bite us in the butt here because we're having to go back and add this gap to both of these. Had we used a class, we could have taken care of all of this at once. I do think our padding around this outer container here is a little bit too big. So I'm going to go back to our footer wrapper class. We'll go into our spacing, link all these together. And maybe we go with something like 24 pixels, which just make it a little bit smaller here. And just like that, I think we have a pretty nice footer with all of our responsive settings done. So let's go ahead and save this and take a look at it on the front end. I don't have much built out on this demo site, but if we scroll down here, we can see our footer is coming into play. We have our call to action section up here and this nice contained footer beneath it. Let's go ahead and inspect it and check all these in-between breakpoints just to make sure that nothing's collapsing in a way that doesn't look right. Here, when we shrink this down, we can see these are breaking onto 2 lines. That's not bothering me too much, knowing that we're going to snap to that tablet breakpoint right there. These are just about to collide when that happens. We might want to go back and add some column gap in between these so they don't get too close, but I think we lucked out in the fact that our breakpoint actually happens right at the right second there. So as we get into our tablet breakpoint, we can see this top row is still saying 2 columns. That's something we did a little bit different than the reference site, but I think it looks nice. And as we get down here to our mobile breakpoint, which is 768, we can see everything stacking up nicely. And I suspect as we get smaller and smaller, everything should stay in alignment and look pretty good. So I think the only change I'd want to make is just right here, when we get close to breaking to our tablet here, these things are getting kind of close to one another. So I think if we add a little bit of gap in between these 2 columns, we could save that from happening. So we'll go ahead and pop open our list view here. We'll go back in here and select this bottom container for our footer here. And that grid is actually being controlled by this footer grid class. So let's go inside there. Here inside of our column gap, maybe we do something like 24 pixels, which is going to give us a gap in between these 2 items. You can actually see everything shifted around a little bit. Let me go ahead and get rid of it, add it back, and you can see how some of these items are moving. We have this set up as a 6-column grid with no gap in between them. So when I add that 24 pixels of gap, it's adding it in between all of our 6 different columns. I don't think that's going to be a problem here, but it's something to note if you were trying to line this up on an exact pixel, which probably wouldn't be wise anyways. It is going to affect that here. However, having that gap is kind of insurance to make sure nothing runs into one another. So let's go ahead and just save that and see how it does on the front end. We'll go ahead and refresh here, scroll down, and now we can see as we get these closer to one another, we don't worry about the collision happening in between those 2 columns. Everything else still looks pretty good and scales down pretty nicely. When it comes to choosing between Grid or Flexbox, I think the best way to learn is to just practice and experiment with both of them. There are some use cases like Flexbox is really handy when you're not really worried about setting up an exact amount of columns. You just want things to fit next to each other with whatever width they are. Flexbox is great at something like that. However, if you have some kind of rigid system where you want everything to fit in, Grid seems to do a whole lot better with that. Although you can use these pretty interchangeably, you can make Grid do most of the Flex things and you can make Flex do most of the Grid things. However, sometimes when you pick one or the other, you kind of got to fight against the current, against its default behaviors. So learning where Flex shines and where Grid shines is really advantageous as you do these builds. The more and more you do it, the more intuitive it becomes. And really, this was a difficult exercise for me to try to explain why I would pick one over the other, because a lot of times I'm just kind of doing it intuitively. And that really just came from a lot of practice. So I definitely encourage you to spend more time playing with both Flex and Grid to see which works better in different situations. The more you use it, the quicker you'll pick it up, and you'll be able to use these things intuitively inside your designs. Hopefully you learned something in today's video. If you did, I would really appreciate a thumbs up. And if you want to make sure to catch the next one, hit subscribe and we'll see you then.